Raising Us is sponsored by Nugget, makers of the original Play Couch.
Don't tell her bad, no. Don't give her negative reinforcement. Just don't encourage her because people say, oh, they encouraged her to be a girl. No, just follow her lead, and that's what we did. So those early days were just like touch and go. How you doing, Jazz? What do you want to wear today? Oh, a dress, of course.
Parenting doesn't come with a script, but it does come with lots of questions. I'm Elise Hugh, journalist, mom, and your host for Raising Us, a podcast from The Kids Co. Every week, we break down the big, timely topics so you can have honest, meaningful conversations with your kids, because these conversations matter. And every time we show up for them, we're not just raising thoughtful kids, we're raising us, too. One of the first things expecting parents often learn is their baby's biological sex, and that can feel like just the beginning. But as kids grow, gender gets way more complex, full of all these unspoken rules and expectations. Boys aren't supposed to cry, girls are labeled too emotional, and even though we know those ideas don't make sense, they still shape how kids see themselves and the world. Plus, there are so many folks who live outside the traditional man-woman categories, showing us just how rich and varied gender really can be. And today, with growing political pushback, it's more important than ever that parents feel ready to have honest conversations about gender to help their kids be kind, curious, and confident. Today, we're joined by two thoughtful guests on this topic. Later in the episode, we'll talk with Dr. Diane Ehrensaft, a developmental and clinical psychologist who specializes in gender. But first, we'll hear from Jeanette Jennings. She's president and co-founder of the Trans Kids Purple Rainbow Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting transgender youth and their families. She is also the proud mother of 24-year-old transgender activist Jazz Jennings. Jeanette Jennings, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you walk us through what those early days with your daughter Jazz were like?
Well, Jazz just turned 25, so we're talking more than 20 years ago, but I will dig back into those early days because I do remember them well. She's the youngest of four kids, so I thought I was very experienced in motherhood when she came around. And this little baby was full of energy. She was a great kid. And as soon as she could start expressing herself, she expressed herself in feminine ways. You may say, well, what is that? Well, she wanted to play with dolls. She liked everything sparkly. We had to play wigs. She put it on. Plastic stilettos from a dress up, one of those little dress up compartments. She pulled it out and we were just like, okay, he likes girly things, whatever. Maybe it's just a phase. I went to the preschool. What's going on? My 2-year-old, likes to dress up as a girl. And they said, oh, it's fine. I'm like, yeah. But he says he's a girl, not like I like girly things. He would say, I am a girl. And they had never heard of that before. So, I let some months go by and this face just kept getting stronger and stronger. And I'd say, good boy. And she'd say, no, mommy, good girl. Like, all right. I have a master's in clinical counseling. So I have something called the DSM. And I pulled it out and I went to what was called gender identity disorder, which is now gender dysphoria. And it said, if the child meets 4 out of the 5 markers on here, they have gender identity disorder. It's a mouthful, which is also being transgender. And she hit all 5 of the markers. And immediately I knew something was up. And I take action quickly. And I contacted a doctor who contacted another doctor. And she went in for an evaluation. And she met with the doctor. And the doctor said, I have a lot of patients that are trans. And your daughter, to me, is definitely transgender, gender identity disorder, but she's only 3 years old, and I don't know how to treat a 3-year-old. So, of course, we were frightened. We were like, what is going on here? What is this transgender stuff? She wanted me to meet with a transgender woman. And, my head was spinning at this point. She wanted to go to school with daddy for daddy's night, and she had to dress as Belle. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to dress up as a cowboy. And my husband was very hesitant. He was scared. He was nervous. How am I going to bring my son dressed as Belle? But he did it. But, you can imagine what all the other parents were saying. And it was just touch and go. But we finally found a doctor who had worked with other kids like Jazz and said, just follow her lead. If she says she wants to do this and that, don't tell her bad, no. Don't give her negative reinforcement. Just don't encourage her because people say, oh, they encouraged her to be a girl. No, just follow her lead and that's what we did. So those early days were just like touch and go. How you doing, Jazz? What do you want to wear today? Oh, a dress, of course. And we didn't at first let her wear dresses to school until she transitioned, which was later.
What was that like for you? What were those early conversations between you and your husband, you and the siblings like regarding Jazz and Jazz's gender?
Well, at first, my husband and I, we didn't know what we were doing. And once I spoke to the doctor, I was on board 100%. I'm like, whatever I need to do, I want this kid to be happy. I read statistics about people who are transgender and taking their lives much more frequently than other people. And I'm like, no, I want my child to be happy. My husband was a little hesitant at first, like I said, in the Bell instance, but eventually he came around when he saw that, this was an issue and how unhappy she was if we like forced her to wear a boy shirt. And as for the other children, the twin boys that are just older than her, they don't remember Jazz being a boy. It's like they just like, oh
No
yeah,
memory of it.
no, our
Yeah.
brother likes girly things, like as far as they knew. But my oldest daughter, who's very bright, was the princess. She was the oldest kid. She was the star girl. It was like three boys, one girl. That's me. And we had to sit her down and explain to her what it was to be transgender, what this meant for our family. And she was like, but I'm the girl, I'm the girl. And then like I said, she's very bright. We had to tell her this is something very important because kids like Jazz are very unhappy. And I was very tough love with her. I said they could be suicidal. We need to support her. And she said to us, it was very emotional at the time. She says, I'm going to love Jazz for who she is. I'm going to be the best big sister I possibly can be. This is like a 7, 8-year-old saying this to us. So it was tough for her. As a kid, how do you navigate this? Nobody else has this going on in their homes.
But now, obviously, the science has come around on it and the research community, and obviously, this is not considered a disorder anymore.
No,
How do you think about um, transgenderism?
I feel the transgender people are up here. I've met hundreds of them now, and they are the most creative, the brightest, the wittiest, glamorous, and just good friends. They have huge hearts. I just feel in other cultures that they're called two spirited. And I do believe that transgender people have more going on than any of us because they're working two sides of their brain and they're very knowledgeable. They just like Jazz was an old soul from the day she was born. And I have always had a lot of respect for the trans community. I will do anything for them. Even though I'm not transgender, I'm like, these are my people and don't mess with them. These are good, good people, hardworking people, loving people.
Was there a moment that really sticks out for you in your mind in that part of your family life, just navigating the early days of understanding who Jazz really was, that was incredibly rewarding or, on the flip side, challenging?
I have both those examples actually. As Jazz was little and we were growing into all of this, she would run around the neighborhood, and this was before she officially transitioned. So she had wigs on and she was wearing sparkly clothes and she was playing with the neighborhood kids. And we had somebody down the street who they were religious, and I didn't know what religion. I just know that they were really good people. And I was afraid, what are they going to think of us? And the mom came knocking on my door one day and I was like, oh no, was she going to say something about Jazz? And she was like, Jazz comes over to our house a lot and plays with my kids. And I'm like, yeah, and your kids are down here too. And she goes, I want to let you know that Jazz is an amazing kid. And she actually said Sparkles. So let's backtrack. She said, I want to let you know that Sparkles is an amazing kid. And we all love Sparkles. And she's welcome in my home at any point in time. And my heart just sank. I was just like, thank you. Thank you. And I wish they still lived down the street now, but they don't anymore. They turned out to be good friends, wonderful people. But on the flip side, we'd go to preschool and I'd have a mom look down at Jazz and say, why are you dressing him like that? And I would say, well, that's what he wanted to wear to school today because the pronouns were still he, him at that time. So I had a lot of those, whispers and pointing and situations like that were very, very, very tough.
Well, the wider world got to see so much of Jazz's transition journey from interviews, that did with Barbara Walters, to the TLC reality show y'all were part of, I Am Jazz. What kind of impact did that public exposure have on Jazz and on the family as a unit?
Mhm. What many people don't realize with reality TV is that we're not the Kardashians. Like, we are not that interesting in the sense that the cameras are only here like 2 or 3 months out of the year. The kids were kids at the time. There are laws that you have to follow. The child protection laws, I guess, they can only work certain hours. They have to do their homework. So it was confined to many rules and regulations. So it wasn't that hard, the filming process. I mean, it took a lot out of us, but it was a very good experience in general. However, once, we hit the airwaves, we went online and then we saw not everybody loves transgender people. And we had this rule in our family: do not read the comments, because do not read the comment. Even to this day, I try my best not to. But it's hard having that out there. As the show went on and on and on, more and more people started to recognize us. So Jazz is a little bit insecure when it comes to a lot of people coming up to her. She has anxiety about that, but we couldn't go to malls without people being like, Jazz, 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 or, especially like a pride event and airports. People were there from all over the world, which was lovely because they come from different countries. Because apparently we're dubbed across the world, which is really, really funny to see yourself dubbed in another language. Um, I'm like, hola, like, wow, I speak Spanish. So in that sense, that was really nice to get feedback. The most hate we usually receive is on the internet. And it's very unpleasant, but we try to look at the positive side of everything.
As Jazz got older, what were some of the biggest changes that you noticed in the way that your family, the wider family, or the community responded to Jazz and her transition journey?
People responded differently. It just depended where you were and who you were hanging out with. There were some people that were very warm and welcoming, while others, just didn't quite understand what was happening. And I'd have to explain to parents, once Jazz transitioned and they didn't know that Jazz used to be a male. I'd say, well, if you're having a sleepover, please, let me explain to you what's going on with Jazz. And I had to have like the talk to make sure that parents understood, Jazz was transgender. She needs to change privately for bed in the bathroom, if you want to have a sleepover. And sometimes we never heard back from those families, and others were very supportive. So, like different situations, we had to be chameleons. We never knew who was going to accept us and who was going to reject us.
Yeah, I imagine that's really difficult to navigate, though.
Yeah.
What was it like for you stepping into the role of advocate as you are now? So you're not just advocating for your own family and your own daughter, you're advocating for all trans kids through your work. What was that transition like for you?
It was overwhelming at first. We were, headed into uncharted territory. I started going to conferences. The one conference, the big one, is Philadelphia Trans Wellness Conference. And I would go there and I would speak in front of 200 people. And I used to shake at things like this. And I knew it was really, really important, that I share our story. And it was helping other families. We would start to throw like these pool parties for kids. And I remember one year, one of the kids came up to me. It was a young boy. He might have, been like maybe 13 or 14. And he was crying. I said, what's going on? He said, thank you so much for throwing this pool party, because this is the first time I've ever been able to take my shirt off and swim with the other boys like this before. So, advocacy to me is extremely rewarding. Knowing that I'm helping other people, is a wonderful thing. If our story can save one life, it's worth it, because I get letters from parents that said, my kid wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for your story or your family, or Barbara Walters interview, anything, and thank me. So I've had moms fall into my arms. I get phone calls to this day. I have a foundation called the Trans Kids Purple Rainbow Foundation, and I get a lot of emails through that as well. Just parents needing support.
For parents who are nervous about having their first talks about gender with their kids, no matter how their kids identify, where do you recommend they start?
Um, well, I'm usually talking to parents whose kids are gender non-binary, like, have something going on. I don't really speak to a lot of parents whose kids are cis, or what I call straight.
Cisgender,
Yeah,
yeah.
cisgender
Mhm.
children. But I would say to any parent, Jazz actually wrote a book that explains it very, very clearly. It's not, this is not an advertisement. It's called I Am Jazz. And it will say, this is what it is to be transgender. And I tell parents, to tell their kids transgender people are like anybody else out there. Sometimes their brains and their bodies may look different. They don't look like you or me. And there's a girl that may want to be called him. That's okay. Or there's a boy that may want to be called she. That's okay too. It's who you feel like you're inside. And you want to be a policeman. Somebody can't come in and tell you no, no, no. You have to be a pilot. Like you do you, and that's what they need to tell their kids. And I've always said to parents, parent the child you have, not the child you wish you had. And that's very, very important, because you want your kid to do this and that and the other thing. But sometimes kids have their own plans. And it's like that with anything. You were a baseball star in high school. You want your kid to play baseball, but your kid wants to play video games. Like, I just don't try to force them to be somebody they're not, in any situation. So I feel it's important when talking about gender to be supportive of that child. Like, it's okay if you don't want to do what all the other boys are doing. You're you, and you're wonderful and special just the way you are. We use the word special and unique instead of different. I like that. I like that better.
Yeah. Okay. Very actionable advice. Jeanette Jennings, this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Jeanette Jennings for joining us. And after the break, we'll hear from Dr. Diane Ehrensaft, Director of Mental Health and founding member of the UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital Child and Adolescent Gender Center. She's also the co-author of Gender Explained, a new understanding of identity in a gender creative world. We'll dive into more specifics about gender, how to approach the topic with your kids, and how these conversations can even help us parents with our relationships and understanding of gender. We'll be right back. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And we're just going to get started with the fundamentals for parents because this is a parenting podcast. Can you clarify what the difference is between sex and gender?
Excellent question. We all get confused about it, and it's being used politically right now. When we use sex in that way, we're not talking about what we talk about later on, let's have sex. So it's sex as a noun, and it is really tells us what our chromosomes are and what some of our body parts, both internal and external, are. And usually, not always, but for most of us, the sex we get designated at our birth is because a medical professional or somebody at a home birth looks between our legs, and if it's one set of body parts, boy, the other set of body parts, girl, and that is what sex designated at birth is.
Okay, and then how does gender differ from that? Just so that we can kind of clarify.
So we start with that, uh, and then gender, as I said, is who we know ourselves to be, and I'm talking about gender identity, who we know ourselves to be as either that little boy or little girl that you might have been told you have at birth, or something completely different, because gender doesn't lie between our legs, it's in our brain and our minds. And for many people, there's a match, and that's called being cisgender. I am cisgender. What was designated as my sex at birth was a good fit for me. And for other people, it's not a good fit. That sex designated gender doesn't match the gender they know themselves to be. That's called being transgender, gender diverse, gender creative. It includes all kinds of not a boy, not a girl as designated at birth.
How do kids interact with gender and kind of come across these topics very early on?
I would say kids are our best teachers as to how to interact with gender. They're more creative than adults. They are learning about gender before they're 1 year old, and they bring their own minds to it. And they learn two things. They learn who people think they are as a boy or a girl, usually. And then they have to match that with their own self learning. Does that fit? Does that feel good to me? And then they've got a third thing, which is where I live, how do people do their gender? And what are people telling me about how to do gender, as well as what are people telling me about who I am? So it's an inside outside thing, or we could call it a circle between the outside and the inside.
Okay, so we've talked about what cisgender means. So you identify as cisgender, for example. So you identify as a woman and were born with girl parts. But if you were transgender, you wouldn't identify as a woman. You might identify as a man, even though you were born with girl parts. And that would be transgender. What about non-binary? What does that mean?
Let's start with non binary people are people say, I don't fit in the girl box and I don't fit in the boy box. I may be a combination of both. I may be neither. I may be some other beautiful creation of gender that I will call myself, but I'm not in a box of boy, girl, or man, woman.
Let's bring this to today and the environment that so many of our kids are growing up in. What do you feel are some of the, or what have you found are some of the struggles that non binary or transgender kids are facing?
Right now, the main struggle that transgender children and non binary children and youth and adults are facing is the reality that some people are telling them you don't exist. And they're right there saying, but I'm right here. I'm right here. I exist. And this is creating tremendous stress for all those people who say, I'm beyond boxes. Uh, and for them right now, the struggle is not only to say, I do exist, but to get the people around them to give them what is their what I call human right is to live in the gender that is most authentic to you, filled with acceptance, minus aspersion. And that's a struggle right now in the United States in our contemporary political and social milieu.
Yeah. It occurs to me, though, that it's not just trans kids who are having to face questions of masculinity and femininity and what that means and what it means to perform it. How are cisgendered kids also having to struggle with gender?
That is a very good question. And I would say any child who has a gender, and that's every child, no matter, we don't have a genderless culture, is struggling around gender right now because they're getting such contradictory messages about it. And for some of us, we want to help kids and we want to let them help us get in clear vision what have we learned about gender and what makes the most gender wonderful life for all of us, not for some people, but for all people. And I think it comes with children needing help with learning what we call gender literacy, which is new ways to understand gender and breaking down old gender roles.
How do we start talking to our kids about this?
It's the same way we talk about anything else. We first have to figure out how old is my kid and what's appropriate for their age in talking to them that they can understand. So the talking changes over the course of a child's life. But I would say the earliest thing is to first think for yourself, what do I think about gender? What do I know about gender? What will be a gift to my child to share with them about gender? And what might make life more complicated, difficult, or not fair if I were to talk to them about gender in that way? And we don't just talk to our children about gender. We often set rules about gender and we often set example in terms of how we live our own genders and how we talk about people in the world. So all of that goes into thinking about how you want to talk to children about gender. And I would definitely encourage people to talk to kids about gender in a gender expansive rather than limiting way. It'll be a benefit to all children.
Not just talking, as you mentioned, we are also kind of modeling constantly as parents and having to reckon with our own understandings and our own biases. And it's a topic that's come up in a lot of the conversations on this podcast. In what ways do our own relationships have an impact on our kids' understanding?
Elise, that is such a good question because I learned this from a colleague, Tay Meadow, and we include that in the book that Michelle Jerkowitz and I wrote, Explaining Gender, which is we don't just learn about our children's gender from them, we give children gender. So, as parents, everything we do is making an impact on how our children will live their gendered lives and their lives in general. So, we really have to be very mindful about what we're giving and be able to have ways to talk. So, I will give you an example from a grandparent's perspective. I have a granddaughter. When she was 10 years old, I was explaining to her that when I grew up in Chicago, it was a rule that girls had to wear skirts to school every day. It didn't matter if it was a blizzard. We had to wear a skirt. Girls were not allowed to wear pants. And my granddaughter looked at me in disbelief because she knew me to be a feminist. And she said to me, "Why didn't you protest?" And it was a time to have a discussion about the history of gender as we never even thought to protest. That's just the way it was. One decade later in my same school, kids were protesting. They were saying, "Why do we have to?" And we're not going to. And there were pants protests at the same school. But things change, gender changes. But it was a good story for my granddaughter to realize she was so much more evolved at age 10 than I was at age 10. So it was a learning moment.
I know these topics are already complex enough as it is, but I think that it could be helpful to maybe just talk through how gender and sexuality don't map neatly to one another. So you can be cis or trans, and you can be gay or straight. You can be, and that these things aren't necessarily kind of neatly mapped. Could you just kind of clarify that for parents too?
Oh, absolutely, because it's confusing for all of us. So think of it this way: gender, who I am, boy, girl, or other, and how I do it. Our sexuality, who we're attracted to, who we want to have a relationship with, boy, girl, or other, are two like railroad tracks. They're separate. They run parallel to each other, but they can cross and they definitely can come together at different times. But it's important not to confuse one for the other. So, for example, it used to be, and it has changed, that when we would see a 3-year-old boy in a tutu, the universal response was, "Oh, he must be gay." It was just assumed that was a message about his future sexuality. It may be. It may also be a straight boy who loves tutus. It also may be that that child is beginning to tell their parents, "I'm not a boy, I am a girl." The complexity is sorting all that out. The simplicity is don't make assumptions, let the children tell you, don't tell them.
Okay, what are some signs that my kid might want to start exploring their own gender? And if so, how do I support them?
I'm going to start by saying every single child explores their gender. There isn't a child who doesn't explore their gender. But I think your question is a really important one is what if my child is exploring in a way that says either I think you got it wrong in the sex designated to me at birth. I'm not the gender you think I am. And or I don't like your rules about gender. And in that way, the exploration is often for themselves to just try it on for themselves, what feels like a better fit. But it's also often a communication. It's a message, not to self, but to others. Could you pay attention? I'm trying to tell you something. And I may not tell you with words, but I might tell you with what toys I like to play with. I might just tell you when I get upset, when every time someone says, "What a pretty little girl," and I cry. And you might pay attention to those message that your child is beginning to explore gender. And it can happen as early as being a toddler. So we've had little kids that I know who just go, me not boy, don't say boy, as soon as they can talk. Or they rip off a dress before they have the words for dress, knowing that dress is girl in some way they got it. So we listen very careful to look for our explorers, those particular explorers. And the best thing we can do for them is listen and know that this may take time to find out what all this means. So be patient. It's very hard for a parent not to know, particularly around gender, because we all thought we knew on the sonogram, right?
Right.
So,
Bringing it back to the sonogram.
exactly.
All right, before we let you go, what are a few takeaways or some advice that you want to leave parents with?
Number one, uh, gender is not an easy thing to negotiate with your children, particularly under present circumstances. So, one of the things to be the best kind of, you're not a gender whisperer, you're really a gender giver, is to pay attention to your, what I call gender ghosts and gender angels. We all have them because we all grew up. So, our gender ghosts are things that may say to us, this isn't right. This is that's not the what I learned about what boys are supposed to do and girls are supposed to do. Boys shouldn't wear nail polish. That would be an example of something that we learned. And there's a little boy with his nail polish, so happy. Then we have our gender angels, and they're the ones who talk to our gender ghosts and say, "Oh, the boys can wear nail polish. Anybody can. It's a people's thing." So if we don't pay attention to our own, they'll all slip out. And I would say it's a battle between the gender angels and ghosts, and we like the angels to prevail. So, first, look inside yourself. The second thing is listen, don't tell. And remember, thirdly, that our gender is our own possession. Nobody else can take it away from us. We can hide it. So, the best thing that you can do for your children, listen, be a part of a team that gets their gender in focus. And if they need some help to feel gender terrific, find out what that is. And remember, it's about your children's dreams for themselves, not your dreams for your children. And brush up on your gender literacy and learn new ways of thinking about gender and make sure that there's literally that literature for your children.
Okay, fantastic. Dr. Diane Ehrensaft, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again to both our guests for joining us. Talking about gender with kids can feel like a bit of a journey. There's love, confusion, everything in between. Sometimes both kids and us parents get a little turned around trying to figure it all out. But when we can clear up misunderstandings and focus on what's really true, it makes it way easier for kids to understand their feelings and decide how they want to express themselves. For more tools and resources, visit us at akidsco.com. Thanks for listening to Raising Us. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your shows. Raising Us is sponsored by Nugget.